Okay, let's continue with the second part here, and this is the section on mass wasting, right? So the general concept is pretty straightforward. Everything falls down because of gravity and eventually ends up at the bottom of the oceans. And truly everything, right? I mean, that's just the way it goes. Here's this famous picture of Dan Osman climbing in Yosemite, and he didn't fall down, he made it, but if he would have hung there for a while, eventually he would have obviously fallen off, and that wouldn't have been good. So let's explore this in a little bit more detail, right? So mass wasting is landslides, rockfall, abrupt, fast, short distance mass movement of weathered rock material. And really the coolest example of mass wasting is meteorites, which is really mass wasting or rockfall, if you will, from space. And here's that picture of the meteorite last year striking Russia. Now there's sort of 6 big sort of types of mass wasting processes: rockfall, landslides, slumps, earth flows, debris flows, and creep. And these are all beautifully explained and illustrated in your book. And we're going to go now through a nice little picture show looking at some cool examples of these different mass wasting processes. So we'll start with rockfall. Rockfall is pretty straightforward, right? Weathering occurs at the top here of the cliff. The rocks loosen up, and at some point they just fall down the cliff because of gravity, and that's what we call rockfall. And then they end up lying at the bottom of the cliff here as what we call talus, right? Sometimes they're called talus slopes. Talus aprons is another word you find for them. And here's just an example of what this looks like in reality. Here's the famous examples from Cannon Mountain again, right? So here's Cannon. You can see that sort of lighter colored rock area here. That's an area of recent rockfall. And that material has fallen down in a mass wasting process called rockfall. And you can see it lying here now, that lighter colored rock, as talus below the cliff of Cannon Mountain. Plenty of examples everywhere. Here's a great picture from Mount Rainier here in the background, and here's a beautiful hiking trail we did crossing this talus slope. So this is a pretty steep slope, sharp angular rock fragments. This is all rockfall, all material that has fallen off at some point from a cliff that's up and above us here on the right. So rockfall coming down the slope, and this material just lying on this steep slope or steep apron as talus. Not a good place to stop and have lunch because there's constant rockfall coming down. Another example here we are hiking in Grand Teton National Park. So actually this thing here is the famous Grand Teton in the background. And again, this hiking path we're on, this is my wife here, crossing a talus slope. So all of this material here is rockfall material that's coming down as rockfall from this cliff that's up here somewhere, and it's now lying on the slope here as debris that we call talus. Beautiful example here, recently in Italy. So you have a cliff up here, right? And then here this rock just rolled down the forest, right through this dude's garage, and here is your boulder sitting now on the field. That's the rockfall, right? It didn't hit the house, it just basically ran almost right through the garage. So now let's look at another picture, right? From looking downhill, from standing approximately here, looking down this way. So here we are, right? Here's your destroyed shed and garage, right? Here's that boulder that tumbled down the slope, sitting right here, and this is all an old vineyard here. Of course, very interesting, here's another boulder, right? So that boulder was rockfall, fell off the same cliff at some point in the past and rolled down the hill. So obviously this happens rather frequently in this particular area. What else we got? Landslides, right? So landslides are typically triggered by rain. So rain here is a beautiful example. Here, rain saturating the soil, saturating the vegetation, saturating the regolith, and then at some point that just gets too heavy and starts to slide down abruptly on the bedrock below it. Right? So landslides are problematic. They're abrupt, they're rapid, and things just slide down the hill. Effectively, just everything is sliding on top of that bedrock. Right. Let's look at a few examples here. Here's the most famous landslide in Massachusetts, right? So this is Mount Greylock here, the summit of Mount Greylock. You can see the tower actually here. This is what this looks like today after the landslide. So this all here is bare rock where all the vegetation, all the soil has slid off. This is what it looked like before the landslide occurred. So that's Mount Greylock. Now the most famous landslide in New England is Willie's Slide up in New Hampshire. So that's shown here. So once again, the same basic thing happened. It rained a lot. The soil got saturated. The vegetation got saturated. And then everything started to slide down here on the bedrock underneath it, right? Very famous event. This is the railroad. And then here we have Route 302 going up to Crawford Notch. So you can go there, you can stop. It's a historic site right now because of the story that's behind Willie's Slide. And you can read up on that. What else we got? We got a special type of a landslide called a slump, which is really just a landslide. But here, the sliding occurs on these sort of curved or rotating sliding planes. So they're often called rotational slumps. Right? And they just look a little bit different on the landscape. So here's an example from San Diego, October 3rd, 2007, right? So San Diego here's the freeway, or not the freeway, the road, right? Here's this dude's house, or rather two houses, and overnight or at some point a rotational slide occurred, basically sliding down the road, and the houses rotationally sliding down the hill. Nobody got hurt in this one, but obviously huge amount of damage occurred. And more recently, of course, this is the famous landslide that just occurred in Washington State on March 22nd. You can see it here, right? So here's the rotational plane that all of this material slid on, right? Again, triggered by heavy rain and then just sliding down along this curved sliding plane. You can beautifully see here all the trees lying down now. That, of course, used to be up on this forested slope above. So that was landslides. Now, another one that that's interesting here is what we call mud and debris flows. So these are fast and violent avalanches of rock and mud and whatever else, right? Mud and debris flows are usually real disasters or have the potential for real damage, especially if they're affecting towns and other human settlements. So here's an example from Peru. Here's a debris flow that didn't really do much harm, right? It kind of created this rock and dirt avalanche that slid down this gully here and then spilled out across the pasture here, and all these little dots here are llamas and alpacas, right? But it didn't affect any actual houses or any farmhouses or something like that. See, these guys live further back here. This is where the family lives, and so it only affected some of the pasture that they're grazing on for the alpacas. So that's that. Now here's a more local example. This is from 2011 in Greenfield, Massachusetts on March 7th, right? So you can kind of see up here, there's a gully coming down from this higher area. There's actually a cemetery up here, and because of snowmelt, the ground was frozen, and it rained, and all of a sudden this avalanche of dirt and rocks and whatever else came gushing down this gully and coming across these people's yards, engulfing cars and going across the road and so forth. A fair amount of damage. Luckily nobody was hurt in it. But certainly some damage. Now, the most famous debris flows in recent memory were in December of 1999 in Venezuela, right? So, triggered by a huge amount of rainfall and actually killing 16,000 people. It was an incredible catastrophe. And it's hard to get good photographs that show the destruction, but you can kind of see here where these guys are measuring the amount of material that came out of the mountains and was spread across these cities and towns here along the ocean, right? So we're talking about 6-7 feet of dirt with gigantic boulders embedded in it, and they just crashed through everything and destroyed an incredible amount, and obviously a huge amount of lives were lost. And they still haven't recovered from that, even though this is almost 15 years ago, right? When you go here, this is exactly where this happened. This is debris still lying around from that debris flow back in 1999. You can see how steep the mountains are, right? So imagine it rains a lot, like 15 inches is a lot of rain, and it just triggers these avalanches of mud and rock and dirt and trees and everything, and just like comes roaring down, literally roaring down these gullies, roaring down these valleys, and just destroying everything in sight. And this is exactly what happened there in Venezuela. We see these a lot also locally. Here we have a beautiful picture of Mount Washington. So up here's the summit of Mount Washington. Here's Tuckerman Ravine. And then here's a debris flow that came down fairly recently, staying inside a gully, but kind of ripping out as it went down, ripping out the vegetation down to the bare rock. So what I did, I hiked up in here, and then I went into this debris flow to get you a close-up of what this looks like. So let's have a look, right? So here we are standing at the top here. Here's your debris flow. We're up in here somewhere, right? So you can imagine this avalanche sort of like running down this gully, rock and dirt, you know, sort of running down this, and what's sort of carving out a channel for itself into the underlying ground. So, debris flow at Mount Washington. What else do we have? Oh, an awesome video. We're not going to look at it right now. If you want to see, do watch this probably best ever debris flow video from Austria last week. So yes, very worthwhile if you put this in. An incredible video of a debris flow in Austria in 2012. Much more mellow is something we call creep, right? So creep is, well, let's look at the diagram here. So you imagine this, you have bedrock, right? And then you have soil and regolith and vegetation. And this is a slope, right? And so gravity, of course, makes everything slide down the hill, right? So this layer here of soil and looser rock and vegetation is slowly but surely creeping down, sliding down the hill. And this works even better if you have water in it and if you have freezing and thawing going on, right? That accelerates creep even more. So let's look at how this works, right? So here we have a slope, loose slope. Let's say these are little pieces of rock, and this is some soil, for example, right? Here's your little rock, right? And this is, let's say, wet because it rained, and then it freezes, right? So now everything freezes, and because the ice forms, right? Your little rock particle gets lifted up, right? We see this a lot. We see a lot of these ice needles forming right at the perfect time of the year, right around now when the ground is starting to thaw, but there's a lot of moisture. Then overnight, needle ice is formed, and the dirt particles are lifted up, right? And then in the morning, the ice melts again, right? And your little rock particle falls back down, but it has moved down the hill a little bit in the process, right? So here's an example. Right, expansion, freezing overnight, melting during the daytime. And this motion might only be less than a millimeter each time, but you imagine this continuing over millions and millions of freeze-thaw cycles. Your entire slope will slowly move or slowly creep downhill, right? So we see this all over the place. Here's a beautiful example. Here we have a slope that slopes gently from left to right, right? And here's your horizontal, your vertical beds, and see how as they approach, let's say within like 6 feet of the surface, they do a 90-degree turn and creep to the right, because creep is forcing everything because of gravity to creep slowly down the slope. Here's another example. Here we have a 180-degree turn. So here we have these very weak layers of soil, if you will, of sand, right? And then as they approach the surface where creep is occurring, they do a 180-degree hairpin turn literally and slowly creep down the hill, following the slope here of the topography of the surface. We see that a lot with what we call hooked or bent trees, right? So my wife is standing here, and this is in Switzerland, but you can see this anywhere in Massachusetts or anywhere pretty much. So we got a tree, so there's a slope coming in from the right, and so here's a tree, and it's sort of like bent forward, and then it turns and grows kind of vertically, right? And we see this all over the place, right? So schematically, right, again, we have our layers of rock, right? And then within the, I don't know, the final 6 feet or so, or 5 feet or 10 feet of the surface, right, where the material is loose and creep is occurring, right, the tree trunks are bending forward, are bending downslope, right? So let's look at how this works in more detail here. Oops, that slide is gone. So what happens is that our tree kind of bends forward, but the tree really wants to grow vertically. So even as it's being bent forward, the tree itself, the main part of the tree, is trying to grow vertically. So we have often that hooked section of tree hooking backwards into the slope in the lowest few feet of the tree. All right, so this was our incredibly fast blasting through these mass wasting processes, pretty much as a picture show. And again, you can certainly repeat this and stop and rewind and look at these photographs that I've showed you, a lot slower. You can certainly look at chapter 15 in the book, and you'll find very good information about these different mass wasting processes, all beautifully illustrated. Right? So this was part 2, and we'll meet again. We'll see you soon in part 3, and we'll talk about erosion. Okay.